join us late. I would like to introduce Vincent Stemmler, who's our visiting artist today. He's going to be lecturing in this room and then at 1, going over to VAS 6, the ceramic studio, to do a hands-on workshop from 1 to 3. This programming is made possible by support from a Regional Arts Commission grant. And yay! Yes! Vincent Stemmler is an interdisciplinary artist from St. Louis whose work contemplates the intersections of identity, history, memory, environment, and loss. He holds a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and an MFA from SIUE Edwardsville. He currently serves as an adjunct professor at Flo Valley and Maryville University, and we have several of his students here, which is great. In 2023, he completed a residency at the Kranzberg Arts Center, which culminated in the solo exhibition Doom Scroll, which was later featured in the Counterpublic Triennial. And some exciting things on the horizon. He's one of the 3 selected artists for the Great Rivers Biennial this fall. So you can pick his brain about applying to that and preparations for that if you're in the workshop. Join me in welcoming Vincent.
Hi everybody. Good to see some old faces and some new ones. So I want to start by saying that I did a lecture here, I think it was back in 2022. Jeff had me and 3 other ceramic artists in an exhibition called 4-Part Harmony, and I think he actually had me do the lecture before then because it's all kind of a blur now, but I think I was actually working on the work for the Kranzberg at the time. Maybe both. I can't quite remember. So a lot of the things, oh hey guys, good to see you. A lot of the things in this slideshow are things that if you're a professor here or if you've been here for long enough of a time, you may have heard me talk about them already. So I'm going to try to go over some of these slides rather quickly. I also want to point out that slides that have this silly Sisyphus rolling a boulder through an Ouroboros, or just an Ouroboros GIF at all, because there's several different ones that I use. Those are things that I was working on, whether in undergrad or grad school, that are things that I've kind of returned to in my own practice. My process is really experimental. I work with a lot of different kinds of materials, really non-traditional mediums as well as really traditional mediums. And with years and years of experimentation, there's, at least in the way that I do it, I don't usually stick with one material at all. I tend to bounce around a lot. So this was a portrait from when I was taking a photography class when I was in community college at Florissant Valley, which was something that I neglected to mention on my my bio. Say that I got a BFA School of Arts in Chicago and an MFA at SIUE. I got an AFA at Flo Valley. And during that time, I took a lot of different classes, and I also took photo classes, painting, printmaking, everything. But in photo, one of the first things we did was photograms, and I was pretty obsessed with that process. And just kind of playing around with different materials, I started just putting tape on my face, and then using that to make photograms. And it has this like kind of silly Shroud of Turin effect, but it's also there's this really playful aspect to it, just kind of putting tape on my face and getting an imprint and peeling it back off repeatedly. But later when I thought about it and I kind of psychoanalyzed myself a little bit, I realized that I started at this time using a lot of materials that referenced my parents, who like, it's hilarious, I know. So yeah, my parents like both met in a warehouse. That's where they worked their entire lives. So they would bring cardboard boxes and stuff like that home, and we would make things out of it. And so it really, looking back, it was something that really kind of sprung my imagination as a kid. So yeah, fast forward, I'm sticking tape on my face in art school, and it is pretty funny. So just look out for that Ouroboros symbol. So fast forward to getting my master's degree. I had gone through community college at Flo Valley. I was there for about 3.5 years. It's supposed to be a 2-year degree. And then I went to finished my bachelor's degree at the School of Arts in Chicago. And so what I want to say on that end is that if you're a student, take your fucking time. Take your goddamn time. Okay? You don't have to rush through school, and you don't have to try to take out a bunch of loans. Okay? Take your time. Take your time. You don't have to rush to get the piece of paper. There's plenty of artists, and I can give you those examples too, who didn't get a master's degree, maybe only went to community college, maybe didn't go to college at all, that are famous. And I'm not trying to like bite the hand that feeds. I know we're in a school right now. I got my master's degree too, but what I'm going to say right now is it took me 8 years to get my master's degree, and that's not including the time it took me between getting my bachelor's degree and when I started my master's degree, which was 5 years. In those 5 years, I did a lot of different entry-level jobs that helped lend to my education. Like I worked for a friend of mine who's a welder. I worked for some friends that were doing antique wood refurnishing. I learned mediums in that way too. But it took me 8 years to get my master's degree, and that's kind of the equivalent of getting a doctorate. If you think about it. 8 years is usually how long it takes. So take your time. Move at your own speed. So fast forward to my BFA. My BFA show was during the pandemic. That was fun to try to complete things while the college was closed down. But I returned back to this medium of cardboard. I wanted to really make something that felt cathedral-like, kind of an architectural presence. But I wanted to bring it back to that material of cardboard that was something that really felt like something that was really influential to me as a kid, just playing around and building things that felt ginormous. And so this, I think, was about 14 feet tall by 18 feet wide. I had, plenty of people helping me. Some of these large ceramic sculptures had gigantic molds that I needed help, like carrying the molds, putting things together. Joy Hitchcock was a friend of mine at SIUE, and they really helped me with a lot of the woodworking stuff. They were the woodworking manager, shop manager at the time, and they actually went back and got a full-time job there doing that a couple of years ago. I think they're still there. So if you end up going to SIUE ever, say hi to Joy for me. But I used just really cheap materials here. Beyond using like ceramic, which was probably one of the more expensive materials, and that being said, not the most expensive art material itself, but most of these things were things I found on the street, the cardboard, a lot of the wood, some of the other materials. And the cardboard I just painted with really cheap matte black spray paint, and it just gave it this kind of deafening effect where it really just kind of absorbs the light. And it really absorbed the sound too. And then I poked all these holes into it, and I wanted to kind of make it look like some kind of like a universe. But I left other wider gaps because I wanted you to see the world outside of it. I'm a big fan of like leaving kind of marks of just your process through the work, of showing your process in the work, trying not to make your work into some kind of illusion of reality, like kind of Renaissance painters and people up until the advent of photography would really kind of try to do their best to illustrate. And after that, painting and other types of art forms really became a lot more expansive, where they didn't feel like they only had to do that anymore. And that kind of break is something I'm really interested in my work, where there's a kind of a difference between trying to, or maybe I should say a tension between what happens when we try to depict reality and when we try to depict what is happening inside of us emotionally or inside of our heads. So cheap materials, some wood, some cardboard, you got some duct tape back there, you got some Christmas lights. And then for these vessels, I was interested in really exploring mass production and talking about how just history is like a big game of telephone. We have these urn forms that are described as garden urns, but I took these urn forms from Home Depot and Walmart. So they're hyper mass produced. And then I took molds of them and made them into ceramic. And thinking about how the form almost has lost its authorship and in some ways its authenticity. We don't know who's creating the forms in the factories. We don't know who created the original mold. We don't know what exactly they're based off of. They're allegedly some kind of Grecian or Roman form. But even when we look at Grecian and Roman histories and what their histories were about, we can't say that Roman people made very much of what we see in Rome. Rome was ran with a lot of slavery, and ran on a lot of war and a bit of a military-industrial complex, kind of like some places we could think about today. So, in the middle of this whole structure, there's this figure that I call the will-o'-the-wisp. It's kind of like a spirit, kind of representing like farm laborers. And this figure, kind of based off of things like Van Gogh and Millet's silver paintings, but he's kind of broken down. And he's also reminiscent of an abandoned building, a lot of things you kind of would see if you grew up in St. Louis. And maybe if you were a kid and you grew up around some of those places, you would go inside and kind of play and explore. And that was something that was part of my life, but also knowing that this is a sign of where our nation is at, where our country is at, where our world is. The sower is holding these seeds. They're actually thistle seeds, which is just a personal favorite plant of mine. But what happens with the seeds is they really look like these big dandelion seeds. And that was something I really liked about it too, because, and this was a bit of a happy accident, I sprinkled some of the dandelion seeds on the floor around the sculpture. And I didn't realize it, but there was a ventilation system that was pulling the dandelion seeds over to the window and then blowing them back up. And it just was like repeatedly snowing these dandelion seeds. And it was a really nice moment. But also thinking about the seeds being this kind of symbol of your wishes, of possibilities, of things to come in the future, and what can grow out of various environments. Because really what my work tends to be about is how our environments create who we are. So just another close-up. And if anyone's wondering, this kind of iridescent effect is not like a ceramic raku firing. It is chameleon color-changing automotive paint. So when you look at this sculpture from different angles, it would be different colors. So that was right when the pandemic started, and I had sworn to myself that I wasn't going to go back into physical labor, because before I went to grad school, one of the many jobs I was doing was I was working as a landscaper. And one day I was working really hard, and I was using a metal tamper, and I was tamping down gravel. It was about 113 degrees outside, and yeah, I had a bit of a heat stroke, and I got pretty sick. So then I decided to go to grad school. What am I doing? Told myself I wasn't gonna do this much physical labor in my life. What am I doing? Get out of grad school. It's the pandemic. I ended up having to go back into landscaping. It was the only thing I could find. I had several jobs lined up at community centers. Those community centers had to close down due to the pandemic, so I went back into landscaping. I got a job at a cemetery, working as their groundskeeper. That was bizarre. But hey, the trials and tribulations of being an artist without rich parents, right? So I ended up getting a job at Florissant Valley, which is where I went to community college. Yes, thank you, Flo Valley.
Go Flo.
There's a few of you here, there's 3 of you. So that's our motto, go Flo. Yeah. So I got a job there working as a studio tech, which is something that I had been doing when I was at SIUE, and I'd done this at a couple other kind of community studios. But then one of the professors there, who happened to be one of my mentors when I was a student, he's getting a little older, and he said, I do not want to teach during the pandemic. Do you want to co-teach my figure drawing classes for me? And I was like, well, I was in grad school doing sculpture and ceramics, but sure, I'll give it a try. But he knew me from a time when I did a lot of painting and a lot of drawing. And he had faith in me, and when I look back, those drawings aren't half bad. I guess it makes sense that he had faith in me. But I also got an exhibition there, and without having a studio, and kind of somewhat working in the studios at Flo Valley, I really had been kind of just stacking up materials and making these different kinds of material collages in hopes of someday having a show and then actually gluing the materials together when the time for the show came. So this show was really kind of exploring a lot of different aspects of my identity. I grew up in a single parent family. My mom passed away when I was really young. She was Lebanese, and that was something that I felt like culturally I was a little kind of separated from growing up. So a lot of my adult life I've kind of spent time just kind of reconnecting with those parts of my family, those parts of my roots. But also thinking about these other parts of my family that are not biological. Growing up in a single parent family, I was actually really lucky in a way because I had a lot of people step in to help me. And not everyone has that when their families go through those situations. So I was raised by a lot of different kinds of people. And when I look at a lot of my work, there's always aspects of collage, there's these aspects of mend and repair and aspects of brokenness and loss. And a lot of it has so much to do with just piecing all those things together and how I think about how we're all, in a sense, collages. Our identities are collages of all of our experiences. So this whole show was work that I'd made over periods of years. This piece was actually made before I went to grad school. I just made this when I moved back to St. Louis from Chicago, and I was just picking up random kind of trash from around my neighborhood and kind of surrounding areas. And I found these big bird legs, and I was like, I'm gonna make a sculpture with those big bird legs. I don't know what those remind me of. I'm gonna do something crazy with them. But it's like, it reminds me of my childhood. And childhood goes back to that huge aspect of identity and collage when I think about it. So just kind of picking up all of this just junk, just trash, stuff from the alleys, broken glass from like shattered car windows, all kinds of stuff, and just working it into this object. And there's a lot of sections of this thing where you can really see inside and it lights up. And I could even see how it influenced things like this with the Christmas lights. So other works that were in the show, because it was like kind of a almost like a retrospective, if you could think of it that way, were pieces like this, where this was an experiment from grad school, which is something that I was working on a little bit there, experimenting with cement and casting, and working in natural materials into that as well. But this is something where I should probably have one of those Ouroboros symbols next to it, because this kind of work is what I'm returning to for the Great Rivers Biennial. Other types of material collage from the time, I got this billboard tarp from across the street from the Granite City Art and Design District, which if you guys haven't been there, go check that out. It's a really cool artist-run, volunteer-run space. And they're looking for interns right now. It's a good experience, good people. But I got this billboard tarp from over there, and I wanted to make something about Southern Illinois and my drive from South St. Louis into Southern Illinois, and the industrialization that you see just kind of throughout on the road to SIU Edwardsville. And I couldn't get over the fact that every day I would drive by Cahokia Mounds, Monk's Mound, and then right after that I would drive by this gigantic landfill.
Yeah.
There's this sick irony,
Yeah.
this disrespectful irony that these people putting this landfill here as if they were aware that they're going to make something that's eventually going to be larger than this mound that used to house the high priest of Cahokia. So I wanted to make work about that, to kind of paint a picture of a reality that's not often looked at. And I used trash that had blown off the landfill. I used grass seeds and other seeds that I had, and I stapled chicken wire to this billboard tarp on a wooden backer, and then I grew all these plants and other materials onto it. So this whole thing went through seasons. It went through a life cycle, and it lived and then it died. And it's full of trash from that area, from the side of the highway. There's some Christmas lights in this one too. Those cell phone towers in the background have red Christmas lights sticking out of them. So just they do this thing with the landfills where they tarp it down, I guess. And so that I was using a trash bag for that, ironically. But you know, that was from a time when I did have a studio. And going back to things like these things that just kind of like piles, like this, could have just been a pile on my desk, and it was. To things like this, where I'm kind of thinking about digital collage, to things like this, where I'm using actual objects from my home, and using nothing but natural materials to make something. It brings something really personal to the work. Because all these objects are things that I use, they're things that have been handed down to me. Those are my dad's overalls. And it's a self-portrait. He's holding a hookah that my aunt gave me, and he's just chilling. And it's a way, it's a self-portrait of me trying to unearth and discover parts of myself that I've forgotten about or been disconnected from. And the ironic thing about some of those objects is, like, my dad's German. He's got German and all kinds of other European heritage, white guy. And there's this German beer stein on the desk, but then if you look at the German beer stein, you pick it up, which, you know, wasn't really part of the exhibition. But on the underside of that German beer stein, it says it was made in Japan. And I just think that that's a funny, there's funny things about identity there. So fast forward, I get residency at the Kranzberg Arts Center. It was their first time doing visual arts residencies there. They had done, I think, music and literary residencies previously to that. So there was a little bit of bumpiness in our entry into this space, and that was just something, there's a lot of things in this presentation where I'm going to point those kinds of struggles out because you young artists need to know about it. But, you know, sometimes if I'm applying for something, especially if I'm able to go there personally myself and see what their facilities are and things like that, I will write an application that caters to what they have and what they do at that location. So this place, they had a large format printer for digital photography, they had a wood shop, and they had artist studio space. I was like, perfect. I've been wanting to print out and do these like weird digital collage things for a long time. I need a wood shop so I can make the framing, and that was my whole proposal. I get there and the wood shop's not ready, the printer's broken, and on top of this there's other issues, like they gave us a $1,000 stipend for a year, which isn't a lot of money really, but they did give us space. I'm not going to complain about it, you know. But what I did complain about was that they didn't give us any kind of parking passes or anything, and everything there is in Grand Center, and now I have to pay. They had just upped the price of parking too, so now I'm paying like $1.25 for an hour. And I would be here all day whenever I could. Eventually that $1,000 started wearing out. I didn't spend any of it on supplies. So I had to tell them, and I had to not be afraid to tell them. And I had to deliver it in a way where I wasn't being an asshole, because I know that they're new to this, and if these people are my friends because St. Louis is so small, they're at least friends of friends of mine, and I know that some of those people that were working there were. So, you know, you don't have to be coy, you can just be real with people, but you also don't have to be rude about stuff. So I had to ask them politely, hey, I'm not going to be, it came time for them to check in. Hey, well, let's discuss what we're going to do about the show. And I'm going to say, I don't have much to show you because the things you guys were supposed to have are not here. So eventually they gave us access to that. They gave us a parking pass for a nearby parking garage. And they gave us an extra year at the residency, which was great. Now I hadn't had a studio, and now we have a studio for 2 years. And it worked out, and that's, you know, good on them for doing that. Because one thing that I've noticed about being an artist is that it feels a lot of times like people don't give a shit about you. Everything's so competitive, there's not enough resources going around. Our resources keep getting cut over and over by the orange man and his associates. So it becomes hard. It becomes hard to just find any kind of opportunities as an artist. Everything's very competitive. So for this show, I wanted to make things that were kind of talking about that idea of like environment and identity influencing each other. And I took this photograph it's kind of a panorama photograph of the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, because that's like a place I like to go to clear my mind. But also the idea of a river is something that's constantly changing. And so I wanted to give this piece seasons too. So I created kind of a hardy backer, a substrate to grow things on. And I grew things on this framework that was also holding this mounted collage. I did a digital collage, and then I printed out and did a physical collage. And it was a fun experiment. Working with similar materials, just kind of found things. I found one of my students was using this mirror, and they broke the mirror and were using it for this project. And I said, could I have the cardboard backing of that mirror? And I wanted to use that because first of all, it created this framework, but then it brought this like the idea of the mirror into play in almost like this like subconscious way. And this work is really about kind of my identity as a Lebanese person. My family is Christians. Lebanon's the place with the most Christians in the Middle East. I have a really close friend, and he's Jewish, and we say that we're twins. We have tattoos in really similar places. There's this funny thing that we say that we're twins. We look a lot alike. He's a ceramic artist too. But he told me he's gonna go to Israel, and I said, hey man, I don't feel good about that. I don't really like what the Israeli government does. This was before 2023. This was before any of that, and Israel gives young Jewish men and women these birthright trips. And he goes, I'm just going to go check it out. I got the free trip. I was like, all right, tell me what you find out. He said, you want me to get you anything from there? And like, any gifts or anything? I said, find me some kind of religious aspect, some kind of charm that represents each one of the Abrahamic religions. Something that represents Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And I said, and I want you to bring me back some sections of one of their border walls. Because you don't think that it's that bad, and I want you to see how bad it is. He brings me back these things, and he goes, oh, it's pretty bad. He also brought me back some salt from the Dead Sea. I asked for him to give me mud, but the mud is harder to get there. And this is because the Dead Sea has been being drained by companies that are Israeli companies. And so in a lot of the areas, you just have these like salt formations. So the salt is in there too. Everything's in this metal thing. And another thing I can say about my work is I've worked in museums. I worked in museums and art galleries for over 10 years. One of those places was the Missouri History Museum. And something that I found is missing a lot of times when we look at art is the historical context. Not just the year, but what was happening in that time, in that place, to make a person make the thing that they made. When we look at artifacts in places like history museums, all that shit is made plain and clear for you to read right there, usually. Let's say they always leave a little bit out because they have to. Can't put everything in. But I wanted to bring, this aspect of when I bring things, outside objects, into my practice and try to make something that incorporates them, I started thinking about those things as artifacts and as evidence and as historical items that I'm now integrating into my practice, into my work. And in a way, I'm also collaborating with whoever made whatever the object is, if it's a man-made object. If it's not a man-made object, I'm collaborating with nature. Some other works from this exhibition, just kind of more of these kind of like photographs, augmented photographs, digital collages. This is of Lovejoy Monument, which is in the Alton Cemetery. Elijah Lovejoy is one of the many kind of like local historical figures that were involved in abolition here in St. Louis, kind of in the surrounding area. Elijah Lovejoy had an abolitionist newspaper. He was chased out of Missouri. They burned his original printing press. He moved to Alton, where he was chased out of his house. They burned his printing press there, and then they shot him. There's a lot of other history that's similar to our area that shouldn't be forgotten. And I wanted to make work about that. This cemetery has areas that have like illegal dumping grounds on it. So I incorporated that into the work too. It's not in this photograph, but just below this, I had a plexiglass vitrine that had some of the trash in it, and I was growing plants on that as well. The type of augmentations that I did to this photograph were just really bumping up the saturation, changing some of the colors. I wanted the sky to be this bright red because this was also taken around the time, and to put some historical context into this was taken around the time when we're seeing these photos emerge from different forest fires around the world and around the country that turn the sky red. And so I wanted to kind of incorporate that into the work. There's these little dots kind of floating around which could represent lightning bugs, maybe some spirits, just how I feel about the place. Other places I was documenting when I was making these works were places where I was just kind of tracing back different parts of my own identity. I wanted to go to the funeral where I last saw my mother. And I had this idea that at that funeral home there was a similar alcove to this, and it had like a big tree that was maybe fake, but had all these like fake birds all over it. And I wanted to use it as this like symbol for resilience and things like that. But when I went back to that place and I talked to the funeral director who'd been working there for over 30 years, he told me that I just was telling him about a false memory. So I had this whole false memory that I created that was this idea of resilience. And I wanted to kind of investigate that psychological aspect, that kind of coping mechanism as well. Because identity isn't always what we think it is. Fast forward after this, I was asked to be in Counterpublic, which is a triennial. It's kind of a fairly new triennial that's been happening in the city of St. Louis over the past, I think, they've only had 2 or 3 at this point. So, but it's every 3 years. And they usually involve some local artists, but they also bring a lot of people from out of state too, and they have collaborations with curators from other museums out of state and places like that. And this is a great opportunity, or can be a great opportunity for a lot of artists in St. Louis as well. And this was crazy because when I did this exhibition, other people in the exhibition, there was some artists like Joan Quick-to-See Smith, who's someone who I had heard about when I was in school reading art history books. And this was a kind of a moment where I felt really kind of, I guess, vindicated. This object, this sculpture, is mostly ceramic with inclusions of a lot of these different kind of found materials that are from around the area where it was installed. So I wanted to make an object that was in a way kind of a compression of my experience in this area, which is kind of a neighborhood that's kind of adjacent to where I grew up. It was one of the neighborhoods one of my best friends grew up in as a kid. So I wanted to just kind of take architectural symbolism and bring it together in a sculpture. But I also wanted to think about things that I've been learning about over the past few years. Post-colonialism, all these different kinds of ideas like that. Bringing those ideas into this. Think about what does a pillar represent? This idea of Greek and Rome, kind of the things I was talking about earlier, being almost reflective of our society in some ways. Rome fell because it could not keep expanding. It was really built on warfare and slavery and these other terrible things, and conquering other people. But we build our Capitol buildings to resemble this. And it doesn't really, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. We know that the United States was created on slavery and genocide. And so I wanted to make work that talked about that as well, but I also wanted to bring in these aspects of how St. Louis's architecture is falling apart. Our infrastructure is crumbling. But I wanted to also bring in all these native plants to kind of signify change or growth out of that place. Our tax dollars don't really go towards us as much as they should at all. So again, the kind of Roman column, other kind of things that I brought into the process, kind of pressing clay against architecture to create these big molds. There's a bank right across the street from this where this was installed. And I wanted to incorporate some of the architecture from that. So I rolled out some big slabs of clay, and I went up to this building and started slapping the building with these big pieces of clay. And the security guard comes out and goes, "What are you doing?" And I told him, and then he started giving me all this historical information about the building, and it was a great experience. But I wouldn't have had that if I didn't decide to slap clay on that building. So it's kind of a funny thing. It was a little risky, but I knew I wasn't really doing anything illegal either. Same thing with brick and other aspects of kind of the architecture from that area, and then bringing in some native plants. Another kind of large-scale sculpture that I worked on in grad school. Just kind of wanted to bring this in because these two kind of have a little bit of the similar ideas, a lot of rebar, this kind of breaking. And this is also one of the other larger sculptures that I've done. But after Counterpublic, I didn't really have a lot of opportunities come up. There was October 7, 2023, and that was, everybody knows the Hamas attack on Israel. depending on what circle you stand in, you may also say it's the beginning of a genocide. And being a person who has walked in activist circles for a long time, but never really brought it into my artwork, I thought that maybe now was the time to do it. It's going to be a little hard to talk about, but I'm going to do it anyway. So my friends and I, once this genocide began, wanted to do something, and we started getting together once a week, and we started writing the names of civilian children in Gaza that were being killed. When we begun writing this, there was 8,000 people under the age of 16 that had been killed by Israel in Gaza. And we were doing this out of my friend's studio. And I just thought, what if we brought this to the public somehow? What if we made this to where other people could come join in the writing as just an act of presence, as an act of being with these lost souls for a little while. And then I met this woman, Leah Kosterer, and she's a member of St. Francis Xavier Church at SLU. And she does this program where she goes, I think it's called Artists in Bethlehem. She goes to Palestine and gets things from artists and artisans, brings them back, sells them free of charge, and then sends the money back. And she really wanted to do something at St. Francis Xavier. And I thought, okay, we can do this there. We brought the banners, we hung them up all over the church, and we brought a lot of people from the community together. Right there you have Steve Tamari. Steve was a professor, I think he's still at SIUE, professor of Middle East Studies. He's a Palestinian American, he's Palestinian and Irish. He grew up in a Catholic family, and reminded me kind of my mom in those ways, because we're Lebanese Catholics. And despite what people will tell you about how all this has been going on for thousands of years and all this is about religion, you still have people like Steve, who grew up as a Christian, who cares about his Muslim brothers and sisters. And you have all of the Jewish organizers that help put these things together as well. All of the activism that I've done with Palestine was alongside people like Steve and people like some of my Jewish artist friends who I don't want to mention because some of these people want to be anonymous. But I don't usually talk about these things when I give presentations on myself. I don't really like my ego to go into activism. I usually kind of try to keep this stuff to myself, but again, being here in a college, I want you guys to know, you shouldn't be afraid to speak your mind. You shouldn't be afraid of censorship, and you shouldn't be afraid of those things. I mean, of course, where we're headed, there could be consequences, but if we don't speak up, no one will, okay? So it looks like I lost a couple of my slides here. Maybe I didn't download this right from Google Drive. But so at the front of the church, or I guess at the end where the priest usually speaks, we had a giant billboard, or not a billboard, a giant projector screen set up. On that projector screen, we would have just various images of people that had been lost in Gaza, people like Rafat Al-Arir, who is a writer and a poet and a literary professor in Gaza, who was killed during some of the Israeli bombardment. And we had Rafat Al-Arir's poetry being read up on the stage, interspersed with people reading the names off of the list that we were currently writing as things went along. There was a lot of different artists that collaborated with us on this. A friend of mine built this large kite, which is a symbol kind of that for a lot of Palestinians of hope. There's big kite festivals in Palestine. And this artist friend of mine, who also wanted to remain anonymous, and this is what I mean, some people were afraid of the consequences, okay? She made this big kite and wrote a Rafat Al-Arir poem on it, and we hung that on the front of the church. And it was just this really interesting collaboration because I was raised Catholic, but I felt really disenfranchised from the church, and I tell myself I'm an agnostic or maybe an atheist even, but to be in community with people means to be with people that are different from you. and to be okay with that. And so I'm in this place with all these people from all these different religions, and we did something that felt really touching despite the horrible circumstances. After this, I was asked to do some work for Michael Brown's parents. Mike Brown Sr. and Cal Brown asked me to make a sculpture of Michael Brown for the upcoming anniversary of Michael Brown's death. They wanted me to make a bust of Michael and then use his dad's body to make molds from. And I didn't put the picture in here, I guess, but it's just a funny picture. He's got his arm is just covered in all the mold making material. But they had similar ideas with what they wanted for this sculpture, and I think that's probably why they chose me to help them make it, where they wanted to incorporate things from Michael's life. They wanted to dress the sculpture in Michael Brown's own clothes, have his high school diploma present, and have him seated at a school desk. So the whole design was really their idea, and I was just there to try to help them. And again, these are things I don't talk about a lot, but I'm also just realizing that I shouldn't be afraid to talk about these things. So a lot of this slideshow is just me kind of talking about how I've been going through it for the past couple of years, and how that's part of being an artist and it's part of life. And I feel like I would be inauthentic if I wasn't to tell you these things. So I had a studio at this place called Sculpture Works Ferguson for a long time. It was great. The city of Ferguson let us use it. Actually, for a long time, it was their building. But eventually, they wanted to take it back. So we had to have our final exhibition there. And it was just like a great community space. There was, for a long time, there was a lot of different exhibitions there, bringing artists from all over the country to show there. And eventually, the city wanted it back. And the rumor was that they were going to try to put some kind of police training center there. So you see this building being taken from artists and given to this kind of police state idea. And this idea here, where I have a projector screen, a camera, and some plants, is this idea of an infinity of history repeating itself, just some kind of installation work that I've been kind of playing with, which also began when I was an undergrad. And when you have these delays set up with a projector screen and a camera, what happens is each frame that goes back into space, when someone moves in between the camera and the projector, there's a lag in the time. So you can literally see yourself going back in space. You can see yourself going back in time. You can see a glimpse of history, even if it's only for a few milliseconds. I think that that's really interesting. This is another thing I'm kind of returning to for the GRB. After this space was closed, I didn't have a lot else going on. I was just kind of without a studio, making work that really was just demo work for my students, or just things that were, again, just kind of piles of material, things like that. I had, about a year after Counterpublic, and kind of keeping my mouth shut about my activism, I started getting quite a few opportunities. There was an exhibition at the Pulitzer, and that was going to be organized. Mary Mattingly, I believe was the artist's name. It was going to be organized by her, and she was going to have some work on the show as well. But she wanted to bring in this idea of like an artistic ecosystem, creative ecosystem, into the work. She really liked my work. There's a lot of similarities about environment, about identity in the work. But she also wanted to bring in a lot of other local artists. But what ended up happening with the Pulitzer is, what they told me was that the curator, who was putting this exhibition together, was taking a job somewhere else, and that the Pulitzer no longer wanted to move forward with the exhibition. Whether it was like that, it was like a huge undertaking, or that they just didn't want to move forward without that curator. For me, it was a big disappointment. For the artist Mary Mattingly, I'm sure it was a big disappointment too. And I don't know who the other local artists were, but I feel like sometimes it just feels so hard to get opportunities that I'm sure they were very, very disappointed as well. And in some ways it just felt unprofessional. And you're going to hear me say that a few times here. That was something that felt unprofessional. And I think the unprofessional thing on my part was that this major foundation hadn't produced any form of contract. We'd been talking about this for about half a year, and no contract was produced. The next few instances that I'm going to talk about of other shows being canceled, there was no contract produced by the institution, nor by me. And what I'm starting to believe is that I need to start producing my own contracts. There was no contract produced. There was no way for me to like protect myself and say, hey, this is messed up, other than for me to do this and say, hey, that was kind of messed up. After that, there was a couple other shows. I had a group DIY show that was being put together. This was some of the work that was in that show. I just wanted to kind of talk about my activism a bit. There's a Palestinian flag. There's a kind of a drawing of like a broken border wall. What is life without borders? There's a photograph of the workhouse up in North St. Louis being overtaken by plants as it had sat there after being abandoned when the Close the Workhouse campaign got what they wanted. And I wanted to make work about that because, like I said, I hadn't been making a lot of other stuff. And this was a DIY show, so there wasn't much curation on the curator's part. He put me in a spot that didn't have a wall and was a ramp. And then when another artist decided to drop out of the show, I was given a spot with a wall. Now I have to change what I'm going to put in the show. And I say to this curator, who is also someone who happened to be an old mentor of mine, hey, I think I'm going to put some work in that has to do with what I've been going through in the past couple of years. Okay, bring it in, hang it up, and we'll take a look at it. I brought this work in and hung it up in this gallery space before any of the other artists had ever installed in the space. About a week and a half before anyone else installed. The curator goes in, sees my work, says it looks great. The only thing he thought of changing was that maybe we should put that concrete piece that's on the floor on some kind of white pedestal, maybe even a very low pedestal, so that it can differentiate and maybe no one will step on it. 2 days later, he calls me, he's freaking out, tells me that I blindsided him by putting this work up, tells me he's not a Hamas supporter, and this, that, and the other, and I say, I'm not like a Hamas supporter, I just don't like genocide. And he tells me, put something else in the show, or take your work down and get out. I took my work down and I got out. This was somebody that was my mentor. It was heartbreaking. Activism's always been a part of me and a part of my work. I make a lot of different kinds of work. Some of it's not directly about activism or about any of these hot button issues. Some of it's just me experimenting. Some of it's me throwing on the wheel, doing things that feel calming. I also do a lot of gardening. But all of these things I've found, I do them so much and I produce so much that I could do something with that. A lot of times when I make a bunch of ceramic work, I'll do a fundraiser. If I have too many plants growing in my garden, that happens to be a community garden, and there's often an overabundance, I try to give those away to either my neighbors or to places that are distributing food to homeless folks or people that need it. When the pandemic first hit, I organized a sale to help take care of the homeless population in St. Louis, and it was with other artists, and we're always kind of posting our work online, and collectively we raised about $10,000. That summer I also grew a fuck ton of vegetables, and I would say we probably gave about 800 pounds of vegetables away to homeless shelters over the period of the summer of the season. So those things are a big part of my work. Jumping back and forth kind of here, going back to these plants and what I'm doing with them. I use a lot of different plants in my work, and it's kind of been something that's getting more and more crazy as I go along. But I've been using these mullein plants. I always thought they were native. I did a little more research, and I realized that they're not native. They're actually an invasive species. These mullein put out millions of seeds. The seeds, I could compare them to the size of like an ant's head. And they spread very rapidly all over the place. And I was always really drawn in by these plants. I know they have medicinal qualities. They they're an expectorant, so they can actually help with different lung issues and help you breathe, which I always thought, that's like a meditative thing. They're invasive, Vincent. So what does it mean for me to take just some invasive plants, here's me posing in front of that thing, and put them in front of this kind of infinity loop? I'm thinking about colonization. I'm thinking about how do we make do? How do we stop this infinite spread of pain? And so for GRB, I'm going to be doing a gigantic installation of these mullen. I've just been collecting them over and over. And I try to empty out as many of the seeds into a bag before I do, so they don't spread while I'm just moving the plants around because there's so many of them. But I'm also thinking, like, can I cook with those seeds? What can I do with them? So I get these plants a lot of times from like the side of the highway. I have a little space in one of my neighbor's buildings. It's kind of like my little studio, and we have a studio cat there named Dwight, who's really who got the GRB for me, because all of the curators were just like in love with him. So it took all the pressure off me. Hey, I could have just said nothing and he would have got it for me. He would probably started talking. So, but getting these mullen is like kind of funny. Like, just I see them on the side of the highway, I pull over, I grab them. It's just like kind of a silly thing. And also, I used to have a big truck, so doing these kinds of things was funny, but now I have a tiny, like the smallest Prius you can get, so like, it's pretty hilarious. It's like a clown car with plants. But yeah, there's that Ouroboros. Like I said, this is something that I've revisited multiple times. First time I kind of started playing with this was when I was getting my associate's degree during my BFA, and then I returned to it multiple times since then. Other things I'm kind of bringing into the Great Rivers Biennial, I have just a lot of different ideas, and at the end of the day, it really ends up being what the curators want to do, and that's what they're there for. They curate. My job is to be an artist. I'm going to make a shit ton of work, and I'm going to let them decide, or I guess I can help them too. Me sometimes. So I've been working on a lot of different things. Right now I have the time, and thanks to the GRB I have the funding. And some of these things are just kind of revisiting ideas of landscape, of memory, the difference between how do we depict a memory and what the memory actually is. This is probably going to end up being like a small fountain, but it's really just kind of a sculpture of a drainage ditch, and thinking about environment and infrastructure again, and how do we influence our environment and vice versa. But I'm also bringing in some other ideas that are things that I've played around with and am revisiting. For a long time, I've been kind of going back and forth making these really sculptural vessels. This started when I was auditing classes at Merrimack with Jim Ivor, and an old friend of mine, Bob, was there. And after the class would be over and we'd get kicked out of the studio, Bob lived really close by, and he had a shed, a very small shed, with a little studio in it, and we called it Shed Ceramics. And we just collaborated. Like, we would just stay up all night drinking coffee and just make stuff. We called them Frankenpots. He would throw on the wheel, and then I would bring these sculptural crazy elements into it, and we would do these collaborations. And it was really playful, and it was fun, and he just kind of kept doing his thing, and I kept doing mine. But I took with me that kind of experience of bringing all these different textures together and making a whole object out of them. It kind of harkens back to all the collage that's in my other work, in a way. I'm taking slabs of clay, giving each slab its own experience through pressing texture, carving into it, taking it to specific locations and maybe slapping things there, slapping clay around on those objects, getting those textures, bringing all those experiences together to make one whole. It talks about, again, our identities, how our identities are collage, how all these experiences make us as a person, but also it talks in a way very generally about society and how for us to work together, we have to accept each other as different and be with each other and be present. And there's that silly Ouroboros again. So for the show, kind of going back to some of those other ideas, I'm working on these larger sculptural pieces. And these are going to be some large cement pieces. Unlike just that head that I've shown, and is also on the flyer out there, I'm bringing in some kind of full-figured pieces into this. And there's the basis of one of those there. And there's what it's referencing. So that's the end of my presentation.
have other questions?
I can answer questions there too.
Yep.
Do you, there's two people. Who's gonna be in the studio later? Are you guys gonna be in the studio later? No? Maybe, but you probably, you know?
My question is, you spoke, I'm not going to be in the studio.
Okay, yeah, that's what I'm saying, just go ahead.
You spoke about
Yeah.
identity not always being what you think it is, or what we think it is. Can you say more about that? It's not a question, it's just, can you say more about
Sure.
that? Yeah.
Well, so for me, I've learned a lot about myself over a long period of time, and there's these elements of kind of like deconditioning who I thought I was, or deconditioning traumas that are put into us and things like that. But there's also perception and how that relates to identity and how we perceive somebody, judging a book by its cover. So both of those things kind of go together, and that's kind of what I mean by that. Yeah. But from like, yeah, a really personal level, like we don't always know who we are. Sometimes it takes a long time to learn. Alright. Anything else about that? That answer your question? Shall we?
If anyone else has a pressing question, we have time to ask it. Otherwise, we can walk over together.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, you went back to see the fountain or whatever that you remembered, and then they said it was never there.
Yeah.
How do you rationalize that, or did you think about, figure out?
So that, I've been in therapy for a long time. That's also what's helped me figure out who I am a little bit more, I think, or figure out those kind of conditioning things I was kind of mentioning. But what I think about those things is kind of like the idea of a repressed memory or creating false memories into your imagination as a coping mechanism. So I was thinking about and really kind of ramping myself up in a kind of depressed anxiety way, like, all right, I'm going to go to this funeral home where like the last place like I saw my mom, and it's like really heavy. And in my mind started being like, there's that tree there. It was a fake memory. I was creating something for myself to chase after that was giving me probably some form of dopamine and this satisfaction of, oh, I came up with this great idea, I'm going to use that as a symbol of resilience. So my ego tricked me in a way that was also protecting me from my own pain. And that's how my psychologist, my therapist would talk about it. So, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you guys.